In the early 20th century, a group of Jewish historians devoted themselves to creating a sense of Polish Jewish belonging through academic research, teaching, and the popularization of the Polish Jewish history. They tried to forge a community aware of its past, its cultural heritage, and its achievements. Who were these scholars? What inspired them? What is their legacy? Their story has been told by Professor Natalia Aleksiun in her forthcoming book, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, to be published in a few weeks by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization, an imprint of the Liverpool University Press. And tonight, we are going to talk with the author and our other guests about this book. My name is Maciej Gugała. I'm with the Center for Historical Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Berlin, and I'm pleased to welcome you at this event, co-organized by the Center for Historical Research, Touro College Berlin, and the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. We are broadcasting live via the Zoom platform and our Facebook account. And to these of our viewers who'd like to ask our guests a question, please send your questions through the Q&A communicator visible at the bottom of the screen, and our guests will try to answer them at the end of the meeting. Now, let me introduce our guests, chief among them, Natalia Aleksiun, Professor of Modern Jewish History at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies at the Touro College in New York. Professor Natalia Aleksiun specializes in the social, political, and cultural history of modern East European Jewry. She received her PhDs first at the University of Warsaw and then at the New York University. Her Warsaw thesis won the Polish Prime Minister's Award for doctoral students. A fellow of renowned institutions in Jerusalem, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Munich, and Vienna, she authored, among others, the book Where To? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1944 to 1950, which is based on her Warsaw doctoral dissertation. She has published many articles in scientific journals, and some of those journals she also co-edited. Welcome, Professor Natalia Aleksiun, and we are very happy that you accepted our invitation. We are also joined tonight by Professor Stephan Lehnstaedt of the Touro College Berlin, historian, expert in the 20th century Jewish history with a focus on the Second World War and the Holocaust. And it is worth adding that it was Professor Lehnstaedt who inspired us to organize this meeting, so thank you very much for this inspiration. Professor Marcin Wodziński, head of the Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław, expert in the 18th and 19th century Jewish history and literature, author of books on Hasidism and Haskalah, among others. Professor Igor Kąkolewski, director of the Center for Historical Research in Berlin, specializing in the early modern history of Poland and Europe and Polish-German relations throughout centuries, including the history of German and Polish Jews. Invisible to our viewers is Agnieszka Zawadzka of the Center for Historical Research, who is supporting us technically tonight. Professor Natalia Aleksiun, before I give you the floor, I would like to congratulate you on the book, Conscious History. I will show the cover of the book. Let me share the screen. This is the cover. Not sure if it's properly visible. Okay. As I said, the book is due to appear very soon, but we have already had an opportunity to read this collective biography, as you call it. And I would like to thank you for taking up a subject which is really a story worth telling, a story which to some may seem quite an unexpected one or not obvious. And I'm saying this in reference to the first sentences of your book, in which you recall your first encounter with the works of Meyer Bałaban, an icon of the Polish Jewish historiography. And it was during your studies at the University of Warsaw when you were advised to read Bałaban's works while you were looking for some material on the 1863 January uprising in Poland. And suddenly you encountered a completely unknown world of Jewish historiography about which you hadn't been fully aware. And what I liked so much about this personal flashback of yours to your student times is that it actually seems to be quite a common experience for young historians who often by accident get to know this whole huge chapter in Polish historiography, which is the Polish Jewish historiography, something that Polish history students are not generally taught about during their studies. And yet Conscious History, your book, presents such a rich story. So thank you again for shedding a strong light on it. So could I please ask you to tell us what this term that you coined for the title, Conscious History, means, and what is exactly the history that you're telling about in your book, and what inspired you to write this book?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gugała, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Stephan, for initiating. I guess it's a greeting from Touro to another Touro institution, and I'm really pleased to be here. And Maciej, if I may, without ever drinking Bruderschaft to call you this way, let me indeed get slightly personal beyond what you revealed from the book, because I think in some ways it's an interesting story of a topic finding its author, and then its author realizing how many connections there are, and it's almost spooky. There are no ghosts in this book, but nevertheless there is something quite strange. So one is indeed the moment in which Professor Henryk Samsonowicz, who was one of my teachers, one of my beloved professors at the University of Warsaw, suggested I read Meyer Bauerban, but I also didn't realize at the time that Samsonowicz was a student of Marian Małowist, and Marian Małowist was a student of Marceli Handelsman, and Marceli Handelsman was the person responsible for inviting Meyer Bauerban to take on a position as a professor of Jewish history at the University of Warsaw. So there is a whole academic genealogical line of succession, as it were, that I was not aware of. And then as I finished the book, I realized that I became a friend with Isaiah Kupperstein, who tragically passed away a year ago, almost to the day, who in 1975 was the chairperson of Junge Historikerkreis at IWO Institute in New York, a sort of a new version of a group of young Jewish historians interested in pursuit of Eastern European Jewish history, clearly harking back on the group that existed in Warsaw in the 1920s and 1930s with Emanuel Ringelblum, Raphael Mahler, and Bella Mandelsberg as one of the initiators. So in a way, there are so many connections in a book that, is about historians and is about history writing, probably not what you think as a tense, suspenseful story with a lot of personal links. But there is also a story of intellectual project that I think has still a continuity and a bearing on the kinds of Jewish history, and especially the kinds of Polish Jewish history we are writing today, whether we are very aware of the link to the past or less aware. And now conscious, let me, if I may, show you a few pictures, and it will also help me time myself and not to go over the time budget that you kindly gave to me. Oops, and now it seems to be, you're getting a sneak preview of everything. Now, conscious history is in two ways conscious. One of the main arguments of the book is that this project, writing of Polish Jewish history between the two world wars, where the focus of the book is, was a project of creating a community that would be aware of its past, aware of its place in Poland, aware of its particular past as Jewish and as Eastern European Jewish past, and as past of generations living in Poland. And in some ways, this project is so close to what the museum, what the Polin Museum of Polish Jewish History is attempting to tell in its core exhibit. So this is conscious history in that way. The second way is the way in which historians themselves were reflecting as they were writing history, how they were reflecting on their position as academic historians, as minority historians, and as public historians, and all kinds of methodological, political, also practical challenges that shaped their work. So as I said, and as you mentioned, introducing this book, this is much more a story of a cohort, of a group of Polish Jewish men and women than it is an intellectual history as such. Of course, they are, again, facing methodological questions and carrying out their research on all kinds of fields of history, but it is much more about their trajectories into history and into that profession. And again, as I said, the focus is on the interwar period, and really the geographic focus to a large extent is on Warsaw, although Vilna with the Ivo Institute is to some extent also playing a role, and Lvov, especially with its pre-World War I context of one of the key sites of Polish Jewish history writing project. I start with the 19th century, and in fact, the first text that this book takes on is the treatise by Tadeusz Czacki, and then other 19th century Polish and Polish Jewish historians who were interested in the legal status of Polish Jews, in Polish Christian, Polish non-Jewish relations, in Jewish communal institutions, and especially in the context of Jewish autonomy in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But the focus starts with Galicia and with early 20th century historians. What is unique to them in comparison with these 19th century authors is that they bring together their immersion in communal affairs, in Jewish affairs, and their academic training. And they're very conscious of that dual intellectual and communal affinity. Balaban is trained and connected to Lvov. Schipper studies in Vienna, quite a difference. Shore also studies in Lvov, but they all at the beginning of the Second Polish Republic end up in Warsaw, which becomes a magnet for intellectuals and aspiring historians interested in a pursuit of historical studies. So we know most of all of that cohort of Emanuel Ringelblum, and we know of him primarily because of his role as the founder and leader of Onek Shabbat, of Warsaw Ghetto archive, underground archive. But of course, he starts his career as a young student who is rejected from his application to medical school, and instead decides to pursue studies in the Department of Humanities. So in a way, because of numerus clausus, Polish and Polish Jewish historiography gained a scholar. Now, key to this is Maurycy Handelsman, whom I mentioned earlier, and whose photo actually is hanging in the reading room of Institute of History at the University of Warsaw. And, you know, as I was finishing the book, I thought about it, how I remember looking at this photograph, studying for my exams. Handelsman was involved in rejuvenating University of Warsaw during the German occupation from 1915 on, and he had a vision of building a center of history writing, first of all connected to that reborn Polish Republic that needed to catch up on historical research because during the partitions, there was no sustained state support for historical studies. But also he had a vision of building a center that would be close to the rather open concept of what Polish history and Polish historiography would be. And thus his invitation to Meyer Bauerban to take on a position at the university. Just on the side, he also encouraged a Ukrainian historian, Miran Korduba. So there was this inclusive, we can say, Jagiellonian version of writing Polish history as a history of Polish lands. And so Warsaw and Department of Humanities becomes, I believe, a very conscious focus for students to come and study, students who could theoretically, even in terms of geography, could have enrolled in other departments of humanities simply because it was closer from where they were living. What is particularly interesting for this cohort, which is a cohort of Ringelblum and people slightly younger who come of age in the Second Polish Republic, is that there are many women among them. And you know why they come to study history in particular is of course a question that is hard to answer based on university records. They have their limitations, even though enrolling students were writing this short CV, example of which you see here. But to some extent, it's likely a hope for a career as a gymnasium teacher. That was the most probable scenario. And interest in Jewish and Polish Jewish history in particular. This is a group that has a very interesting combination of intersectionality, one could say, of aspects to their identity. Here is Sarah Eisenstein, whose picture you saw just before. One of her documents from the university where she states her citizenship, her nationality, her mother tongue, and her confession, her religion. And for those of you who can see the cipher Polish, her mother tongue stated here is Hebrew, which given her social background and the fact that she's a woman is extremely unlikely. And in fact, among these students, you have people shifting in their declaration of mother tongue between one semester, one academic year to another, which is not to say that they didn't remember what language they spoke first, but rather that they belong to linguistically extremely complex, almost fluid cohort that traveled between Polish and Yiddish and their stated national language, especially if one had explicit Zionist inclination, Hebrew. So here another young woman who came also from Seine, from one pre-partition region to Łódź, and then from Łódź to study Jewish history in Warsaw. Now, universities are not easy sites for Jewish students, especially the 1930s, with ghetto benches, with violence, And you see here a symbolic and well-published, well-known picture of the entrance to the main campus of Warsaw University. So students of history are in an interesting place in which, on the one hand, universities, including Warsaw, are becoming sites of conflict and sites of efforts to marginalize Jewish students, but also in this particular department, there is a conscious effort of developing somewhat of a Polish-Jewish historiography as a school, and they study with many leading scholars of the time. They study with Wacław Tokarz, with Handelsman, whom I mentioned earlier, with Stanisław Arnold, who was Handelsman's first doctoral student. And there is a question in my book that I don't think I solve. It remains somewhat of a question still to ponder, the degree to which this effort of entering academic study of history and entering mainstream Polish historiography, to what degree this effort was successful. On the one hand, something that Jewish historians were extremely proud of, being included in this International Conference of Historical Studies that met in Warsaw in 1933. And you see here some of the leading Jewish historians of the time. Here is Salo Baron, but also Mahler, Schipper, Friedman, and Bałaban. They published in Kwartalnik Historyczny, in the oldest Polish historical journal, in Przegląd Historyczny, the newer one, Historical Review. They also received some grants for academic publications. The best known case is that of Ringelblum's publication of Jews and the Kościuszko insurrection. At the same time, they are minority historians, very well aware of their situation, so involved in building and participating in specifically Jewish institutions devoted to, among others, developing Jewish historiography. So the building you probably recognize, those of you who know Warsaw, this is current Jewish Historical Institute, but this was Institute of Judaic Studies. And you see a group of students and teachers at the entrance. They were not only training future historians, of course, they were training rabbis, social workers, communal activists, but history was a very important part of the curriculum. They also created a group that I mentioned earlier in its post-war version, Junge Historikerkreis, a historian seminar that met on the initiative of Ringelblum, Mahler, and Bella Mandelsberg-Schildkraut, whom you see here, whose work, for the most part, was collected and published after the war in this volume. Here, there was also a grassroots effort to collect material for future history writing. Here is a protocol on how to collect information about Pinkasim, about Jewish communal records, signed by Szymon Dubnow, but also by Bałaban, Schipper, Mahler, and Ringelblum, calling to the general public to pay attention to these precious documents that need to be accounted for. And in fact, one of the students of Meyer Bałaban, Hillel Zeidman, whose daughter Naomi Zeidman is one of the leading scholars of Eastern European Jewish culture and history, Hillel Zeidman went on to design a project of creating the central archive of the history of Polish Jewry, which was to be located in Warsaw, to which various Jewish communities throughout Second Polish Republic were to send documents, either originals or copies. And the third aspect of these lives is their role, these historians' role in public history. And again, this is a question. If they were given positions at universities, would they rather be public historians? They didn't have that choice. They didn't have positions. And they played all kinds of roles and wore all kinds of hats of military rabbis, receiving oath of drafted Jewish soldiers, leading prayers which mentioned Polish Jewish history with these Jewish soldiers, writing local histories that were invited and sponsored by local Jewish communities, sort of more as a memoranda than local memory studies than academic studies. And most of them were teachers of Jewish history, primarily in private Jewish gymnasia. And they did, some of them at least, a lot more that was the minimum program, taking students to local cemeteries, Christian and Jewish, taking them to historical sites, and conveying the story of Polish Jewish history through the lens of local history. And the last question that the book only waves at is the question of continuity, something that Maciej, I think you alluded to, which is what do we make of this project from where we are today? What was the degree to which it continued beyond the Holocaust? And I believe that there are many lines of continuity that maybe are even invisible to the eye at first. And just to end on this note, one of the thesis that I copied when I was sitting in the archives of the University of Warsaw was the thesis written by Franciszka Gustawa Wiesenfeld, as much as her student file. Many years later, I realized that my first Hebrew teacher at the university, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, was in fact Franciszka's daughter. And Franciszka made Aliyah, immigrated to mandatory Palestine in 1937, changed her name, and taught Jewish history for decades throughout Israel. So I'm not arguing here that Tzafrira Azrieli spread the history of Polish Jewry, but there is clearly much more to that continuity and thinking about the importance of history and the importance of Jewish history. That the book ends in 1939, but to some degree, I think there is a story to be written about its afterlife. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation, and I think it raises more questions. I hope that we will have an opportunity to ask them and answer them in the later part of our meeting. We invite our audience to ask questions to our guests. But first, I would like to move to our guests and ask them about their reflections on the book, what kind of thoughts it provoked, and I'd like them to share these reflections with us, starting with Professor Stephan Lehnstaedt. If I could ask you for your thoughts.
Yes, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and when I first suggested that we could make a book presentation here, I wasn't aware how close this book, how close I would come to this book. So it really touched me in a sense that when I started reading it, and you, Maciej, you already mentioned it, and Natalia also mentioned it, that she had this experience with Samsonovich recommending to read Bauerban, and I must say this is something I had a almost similar experience when writing my Habilitation, and I was doing that at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. And I was dealing very much with the Austrian occupation of Poland in World War I, and they were based in Lublin. And at some point, a colleague, a German colleague, Jürgen Hensel, whom I consider as kind of a mentor, told me, well, so, but have you read Meyer Bauerbahn's Die Judenstadt von Lublin? So I went, and I figured out that actually there is a new edition of the originally German version, and I bought that and I read it, and it was fascinating. And then, to make matters even better, I then figured out that
you never told me this.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? But let me continue. Then I figured out that the most important work on Poland during World War I actually is, of course, by Marcelli Handelsmann. So I read him as well. And when I started reading your book, and I thought, wow, fantastic! Isn't that fun? And I must say, it really pulled me into your book, and I enjoyed reading it. But apart from this very personal inspiration, I must say this is a book that, in a way, it made me very humble due to the achievements of our ancestors, also due to the achievements you made, Natalia, by writing this book, but mostly by what they already achieved, because it shows the extremely hard and tough work, all the obstacles they had to overcome to establish their field of research. And I think this is the big difference to most of the studies on historiography that we usually deal with, like German historians in the past, Polish historians in the past. For them, it mostly was much easier to start their academic career, to make an impact in academia at the universities. Here we have pioneers who really had to fight to establish themselves, to be accepted as say proper historians by those who were not doing Jewish history. And then, as this is about, as much as this is a book about the academic activities you already showed us in your presentation, and I think this is something that the book that makes the book so interesting to read, is that actually they were so much more than merely academic scholars. So what they did is they had really a census for the wider audience. I mean, they looked at whom to reach beyond a university. They were not just doing scholarship for the ivory tower, and you called your chapter, you have a chapter that is called Beyond the Ivory Tower. And I think this is just what they are doing. I mean, they were public historians avant la lettre. They kind of did that, and it was, of course, obvious for them to do it. Although most other academic historians would have understood themselves as being, well, we are teachers for the nation, but we're never something like grassroots or citizen science, which is also something that they actually did, although the word was not yet invented. And citizen science is also something that other historians at universities, if I imagine German historians before World War II, they would have never thought about citizen science. It would be totally awkward to them. And this all makes me think that what you actually describe is a very modern approach to history. And this was what I probably found the most fascinating about this book, that it is so modern. What these historians did, I mean, I certainly don't have to deal with all the obstacles they had to face, but I think they were so modern. They had such a modern understanding of history as an academic discipline that as an academic discipline has to go beyond academia. And this is, this is how historiography should work, actually. And to get back to my starting point, it's something that makes me even more humble when I look at these historians, because this is, in the end, this is a book not only for those interested in Polish Jewry or interested in the academic profession of history, but it's a book about the relevance of research taking serious. And this is something that's probably more actual now than ever. Well, maybe at the time it was even more actual, but it's very actual, this book. And so I would say it's something to make this recommendation here for the audience. Go and read this book, even if Polish Jewry is not your main focus of interest. So thank you for writing it, Natalia.
Thank you, Stephan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lehnstaedt, for your thoughts about the book. And yes, this issue that you raised about going beyond academia and yes, going with this knowledge into other fields. I know that Professor Marcin Wodziński, for example, has had this experience in those fields. You have worked, for example, as chief historian within the core exhibition team for the Polin Museum, as well as Igor Kąkolewski. Could you share your opinions, your reflections about Natalia's book?
Thanks a lot. I would like actually to start when Stephan ended, namely start with thanking Natalia for writing this book and making it available to us. I think this book is extremely important. It was much awaited, much needed, and so important. And not only, well, you pointed to your individual intellectual genealogy in this book through Samsonowicz, Małowicz, Handelsman. It's in this book, but I believe this book is about our intellectual genealogy of all of us doing Polish Jewish history in one way or another. All we are somehow rooted in Bałaban, Schipper, to lesser degree, Handelsman, but obviously Handelsman students. So in this sense, this is something we very much needed to understand ourselves. And I think this is addressing one of the main problems of contemporary academy, that is in a sense an orphaned academy. Many of us do not see intellectual roots of what we do. And this book provides this beautifully for all of us. But exactly for this reason, and again, referring to what Stephan was saying, he said he enjoyed reading this book. I did not. It was painful to me because it was so much. I must admit here, I committed terrible cardinal sin of a historian. I did presentism. I was reading exactly as Stephan was saying. I was reading this book as the book about ourselves and today. And the parallels I saw in this book are crushing, starting from nasty reviewers and, mean, vicious relations that you trace there in this book, and we have it today. But also, if you look in a broader sense, something very serious about those Polish historians doing urban history and saying, I don't do Jews, right? We have books that write a history of a town and don't mention Jews. And this is a history of the town that 60% of the population was Jewish, right? We have it still today. It is so much replicating all the ills of what you are describing, all the ills that Bałaban and Schipper and Shaw and Ringelblum and Mahler were addressing 100 years ago. And we are still there. We are still in the same place. All the problems of apologetic approaches in Jewish, in Polish, and confrontations. All the problems also going more political. All the problems of using history as a tool in political campaigns that you describe, and we have it today. Also, all the problems of the decrease of liberal positions and the impact of the decreasingly liberal environment on our craft, on doing Polish Jewish history in Poland and globally also. Problems with fundraising and the impact of the financial situation on what we do, what we can and what we cannot do. It's also part of your book. It was so painful to me. I was reading myself in those lines. I know it's terrible, terrible sin. I admit that's my vidui or my confession, but I could not avoid reading it as a book about ourselves also. And this actually was bringing me to asking how far better or far we went from the positions that Polish Jewish historiography was 100 years ago. The gender issue, you say there were, you very, very elegantly say men and women, and you point up to third of those were women. But then you don't ask the question about women of power. How many of the articles in Kwartalnik Historyczny or even in Miesięcznik Żydowski were by women and by men, and then compare the numbers, and then you have this effect of leaking pipe, right? You have women that enroll the courses, you have women that get MA, but you don't have women who write articles, who publish monographs. You don't have women who get position of power, right? So the same problems, the complex relations with other disciplines, which is also visible in your book about anthropology or ethnography, the people on the margins, that I think would be actually very important to look on this, on historiography in context of other disciplines, which brings me to another issue that I saw in your book, and I would like to address it. It was the issue of methodologies. It was the concluding chapter of your book, I believe, Themes and Methods of Analysis. And the issues that struck me there was that you used the word Marxism only once. And then I would like to ask you, because this is something that, again, this is my present perspective into this. How much our debates are informed by political context? How much we are really addressing the issues of how useful this materialist approach is? Who was materialist and who was not? What were not only debates about it, but how it reformulated research done by some of them, most importantly for Mahler, obviously, but the same would be for Ringelblum, the same would be for others, right? So positivism and other comparative approach, prosopography as methodologies, all those issues, I think would be very important to know how conscious of those issues they were, how much this informed their methodologies. And this directs me to the closing question I would like to ask you, namely about actually referring to what we are saying, how you close this book about what remains of them for us today. The examples you give actually are discouraging. It's talking about minimal influence. The name of woman I've never heard of as a scholar, which tells possibly more about my knowledge than about herself, but it's not a central figure, obviously, for Polish Jewish historiography. The problem of who is read and who is read critically and in kind of engaged way, not only to refer to the existence, right, to annotate Balaban and Shor and Schipper, but to go into debating their research, to try to understand how much it informs us, and even more so, how much it informs their students who inform us. And I think this is the problem. There is where the problem is that the trajectory of transmission was broken by the Holocaust. And when we refer to the scholarship, actually I did a bit of bibliometric analysis. It's Schipper, it is Eisenbach, surprisingly enough, who is rather marginal figure for you, but then he rises to power in the post-war years, and very little of others. They are not engaged, they are not referred, and they are not debated in scholarship. So my question is how far this magnificent and so important trend of very modern, indeed, historiography informs what we do today, really, to us. And I have actually kind of sudden reflections on this. I'd like to hear your maybe more cheerful analysis of what we get of this. Thank you. Again, thank you. I think this is an extremely important book. It's also fascinating to read. There are so beautiful stories also there, sometimes so much counterintuitive. When you tell the story of Polish government attempting to create a chair of Polish Jewish history at the Hebrew University, and then the authorities of the university unwilling to accept the donation. Can you give us more of this story? On the one hand, it obviously reminds all of us the story with Polish chair at the Columbia University and all of this misconstructed policy of the Polish government these days, but also at that time, what was behind it? So surprising, so fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcin, for those bittersweet thoughts. I'd like to ask Professor Igor Kąkolewski. Igor, did you find reading this book also painful? What are your reflections? I know maybe I will say something that full disclosure. Shortly before this meeting, Igor told me that he is a fan of Meir Bałaba, and that he also encountered his writings at a certain, well, advanced period of his career. Could you tell us more about what you think about the book and your reflections?
Thank you, Maciek. Yes, it's true. I did my first very thorough readings of Meir Bałaban's book, and mainly his history of Jews in Kraków, well, relatively late, 2007, I have to confess. Nonetheless, and this is something wonderful and something spontaneous about our today's meeting, first time I heard the name of this excellent Polish Jewish historian at the MA seminary held by Marian Małowicz in Warsaw, in his private apartment in the old town at the ulica Brzozowa. And as we know, Marian Małowicz has never done his research on the Jewish history or on Jewish Polish history. He was an excellent expert on the Polish, European, African history, medieval period, and the early modern period were in his focus. Nonetheless, he has never done by himself the history of the Polish Jews. But I have to say, always his seminars every week lasted 3 hours. 1.5 hours was always on the topic we were supposed to learn about, so the medieval European, mostly European history. And then the next 1.5 hour, it was always Jewish history. Jewish history told by himself, and basing on his life, on his family life, on his memories about Marceli Handelsman, but also about Meir Bałaba. So as all of us, I was really touched by reading about you in the library of the Warsaw University, going over these yellowish cards in the catalog of the Warsaw University the library, just searching for the books by Meir Bałaba. And again, thank you very much for writing about this book. I think that the book of Natalia Aleksiun is an excellent monography in the field of history of the Polish Jewish historiography before the Holocaust. I liked especially the chapters in which you presented a broad picture, not only of different generation approaches and streams in the interwar period historiography, with such prominent names as Bałaban, Schor, Schipper, or Ringenblum, but also a broad interactions between academic history and, let's call it, popular presentations of history, history of education, history of Jewish scholarly institutions, and a specific Jewish politics of memory, which you covered also in your book. This is something quite interesting, how the Jewish great historians had an impact on what Jewish Polish Jewish politicians were talking about in the public debates. And you touched upon this issue as well. One of the chapters of your book has a metaphorical title mentioned already by Stephan, Beyond the Ivory Tower, in which you present a broad picture of the Polish Jewish history as presented beyond and outside academia. And here is my first comment and a question to you. Why didn't you try to go, so to say, beyond the ivory tower while presenting the characteristics and ramifications of the Jewish Polish historiography in the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century, so before World War I? In your book, you have analyzed the main works of the Polish non-Jewish historians, such as Tadeusz Czacki, on history of the Polish Jews, as well as eminent Jewish Polish historians, mostly representing the integrationist approach, such as Aleksander Krauschar. However, you have completely escaped to touch upon the Jewish Polish culture of memory, with such popular realms of memory as Abraham Prochownik, a legendary Jew who was to be elected a Prince of Poland in the 9th century, or Shaul Wal, a historical persona who, according to a popular in the 19th century Jewish legend, was to be elected King of Poland in 1587. By the way, Meir Bałaban wrote an essay about Shaul Wal in German, published first time 1911, Dichtung und Wahrheit über den Eintagskönig von Polen, Shaul Wal. Or Esterka, legendary beloved mistress of King of Poland, Kazimierz the Great, which became extremely popular in Polish and Polish Jewish literature in the 19th century. There's no word in your book about the myth of Pauline, which overlapped the Jewish vision of Poland as a paradise for the Jews, and was coming back already to the 17th century and was reinforced in later centuries in the non-Jewish world by the anti-Jewish stereotype of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, disseminated by the Christian lampoons in Latin, Polish, and German as Paradisus Judaeorum, or Jüdisches Paradies. The legend or myth of Pauline spread in the circles of the Polish Jews, especially in the 19th, late 19th, and at the beginning of the 20th century. In Germany, it was mainly disseminated via German translation of the book by Samuel Agnon, Das Buch von den polnischen Juden, published in Berlin in 1916. In your book, you referred to a short article by Chaya Bar Yitzhak, Meir Bałaban's contribution to the field of Jewish ethnography and folklore, but not to her classic monography, Jewish Poland, Legends of Origin. Hence my question to you, wouldn't it be useful to touch upon the more complex context of the Jewish Polish culture of memory in the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century, including the approach of the leading Polish Jewish historians to ethnographic sources? Well, perhaps one short comment relating to my thoughts above. It would be perhaps the more useful, the more so that interactions between literature and fiction and history and the impact on the Jewish Polish and Polish non-Jewish culture of memory at that time are obvious. Let's take an iconic novel by Eliza Orzeszkowa, Meir Ezofowicz, published first time 1878, representing integrationist stream of the Polish literature of the late 19th century. The historical sources referring, among others, to Michael Ezofowicz, an authentic historical person living at the beginning of the 16th century, and, according to Orzeszkowa, an ancestor of Meir Ezofowicz, were collected by Matthias Berzon, a banker, art collector of Polish and Judaica, of Polish art and Judaica, who also wrote a number of short works on Polish art history and on Polish Jewish history and culture, including the first ethnographic work on wooden synagogues in Poland, as well as mentioned by you, documents pertaining to the Jews of Old Poland. Hence, as we see, Jewish Polish historians might have been also involved in literary projects, such as Orzeszkowa's novel, which in turn had a huge impact on the Polish Jewish and non-Jewish public, the more so that the novel Meyer Ezofowicz was filmed in 1911 by a Jewish-Polish film producer and director, Alexander Herz. Exactly in the same year, Meyer Bauerban published an extensive essay in German, Die Brüder Abraham und Michael Ezofowicz, Ritter von Leliwa. So the interaction between the fiction, cinematography, and historiography, all of them being important media shaping culture of memory, is here obvious. And last but not least, one more short comment. I'd like to touch upon a more general problem of the periodization of Jewish history versus European or world and Polish history. I'm very grateful to Natalia for the passages of her book that pay attention to the opinions of Mojżesz Szor, Meyer Bauerban, and Ignacy Schipper, protesting against organizing historical narrative of Jewish history according to the national Polish or any national in an European sense, history mainly based on the history of statehood. Bauerban wrote in his article published in Miesięcznik Żydowski in 1931, comparing the overlapping Jewish and Polish history with an image of a cross. And here a short quotation after your book. Bauerban wrote, "The short, thick stripe stands for the history of Poland. The long, narrow one symbolizes the history of the Jews. The intersection, the rectangle in the middle, is the history of Polish Jews. We must look at the Jews' development in connection with Poland's evolution. However, in doing so, we will encounter phenomena that cannot be explained by Polish history alone, but are linked to Jewish history in general. We will therefore always look at what is beyond the borders of the Polish state," end quote. Also, the team working on the core exhibition of the Jewish Museum Polin was supposed to take on the challenge of the periodization of Polish Jewish history in the line with Bauerban's considerations. Hence, for example, a major role is played in a part of the early modern gallery on the Khmelnytsky uprising, 1648, which has had a huge impact on the culture of memory in Polish, Lithuanian, Ashkenazim world until today. All those who write history books, but also organize exhibitions on the history of Jewry in other countries, have to take on similar challenges related to the periodization and organizing historical narrative about the Jewish history. And here I think we enter into the considerations about the continuation of our ancestors or our old masters, Meyer Bauerban and others. How much do we owe them as people who have been involved in the project of the Jewish Museum Polin in Warsaw? Question mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Igor. And ending this round and moving to answering some questions or referring to some statements in our guests' speeches. If I could ask you, Professor Natalia Aleksiun, to respond, to refer.
Thank you. Sure, it will be my pleasure. I'm just thinking how to do it and not to encroach on everybody's dinner time. But thank you for all these moving and also critical comments. They're very much appreciated. I want to go first to what Stephan was saying, and to some extent very much what Marcin was saying. I agree that this is about research, about researchers taking their research very seriously, and about this project being very modern, whatever modern might mean. But I also felt and thought, working through the material and thinking about their challenges, how much this resembles our professional challenges and our professional ambitions, and in fact exceeds this perception of academia being sort of its own thing, and only gradually, to some extent, I think also due to pandemic, many scholars found themselves speaking to audiences that were more than the usual seminar rooms and conference workshops audiences, limiting to speaking among ourselves. So now this is a question: to what extent, this is a question I'm still having, to what extent this extremely self-conscious about their role as public intellectuals and academic intellectuals, and those two worked very much together. The academic credentials were very important to then take that knowledge and those credentials to the broader audience, both Polish non-Jewish and Jewish audience. To what extent this is a function of them being a minority scholars, and Sam Kassos in his book on Emanuel Ringelblum and Onek Shabbat project talks about the interwar Jewish historiography as a counter profession, and I have an ongoing discussion with him, a conversation with him, because I think that they were more accepted and they were not only functioning in this extremely challenged and kind of by definition marginalized space, but there is a tension, and I think that tension leads very much to take these, what Stephan, what you described as modern approaches to history. And I agree, this is something that I found particularly interesting, this intersection and moving. The question that Marcin asked at the end especially, which is the question about to the extent to which they're being read and critically debated. Yes, I think you're right. What I was pushing for in the epilogue is to pointing to some directions in which people after the Holocaust attempted to carry on the project. But just as Marcin, you used the concept of orphaned academy, I think there is also another way in which this is an orphaned project. An orphan project for us practitioners in ways that simply there's no way around it, which is the Holocaust, which is the fact that they are writing for the largest Jewish community in Europe. They have, at least in theory, 3.5 million readers. Of course, they also want to write and speak to non-Jewish audience. It's very important. But they, as communal history, they have a community to write to. Whereas we today, writing, whether we write about Hasidism, Haskalah, or interwar Polish Jewish history, we're writing to a very different audience. And so this sense of orphaned field very much permeates self-understanding of people that sort of stand on both sides of this project, such as Arthur Eisenbach, such as Philip Friedman. So that is one challenge that I think they all are very conscious of. And it reminds me, just thinking about, conversations in a private apartments of historians, when I was working on my first book on the Zionist movement, I had a conversation in Israel Gutman's kitchen. I will never forget it. It was sort of late in the evening, and we were sitting over tea, and I was telling him what I want to write about, and he said to me angrily, there was no Zionist movement in Poland after the war. Now, I was very young, and I think that only later did I realize why he was angry, because he remembered the Zionist movement before. So whatever I was describing, however many parties and movements and programs that were decided and approved by this or that committee, it was almost a laughable shadow from the point of his memory of it. This is a little bit going into the question of memory, Igor, that you pointed to, and I'll go back to it. And so in that sense, I think for Eisenbach and for Friedman and for Mahler, they were very aware of how different this landscape is, from audience to libraries to all these pinkasim that were being collected. Whatever the students of Bawaban didn't cite in their dissertations, or whatever was not copied by the associations of the Friends of Hebrew University, was lost, or much of it. So I think this sense of orphanhood is one very important aspect of where we are as professionals of this field, as grandchildren of sorts of Meir Bawaban. And then there is the, I think, Eastern European Jewish bias, which is, let's take another participant in this project, Philip Friedman, who was connected to the Institute of Judaic Studies, was publishing important studies in a history of Łódź and in a history of Jews in Łódź, and was connected to Eva. I mean, he was connected to everything that was going on in this historiographical project. But after the war, as a survivor, he is a pioneer of Holocaust scholarship. He sets the goals of the scholarship. He discusses what directions the research should take from 1947 on. But whenever you discuss Holocaust historiography today, the first name that is always mentioned as a founding father of the field is Raoul Hilberg. This is not to diminish the importance of Hilberg's work, but I think that it's sort of the same mechanism that erases Friedman from the memory of the field as such, is something that Salo Baron is central, and his lachrymose, non-lachrymose rather, vision of Jewish history is a founding text in revising the perception of medieval and early modern Jewish history. But the truth is that Bawaban and his students wrote very much along these lines, very much a non-lachrymose vision of the history of Jews in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But that discussion is not well known. And here I'm being very gentle by saying not well known. So I think that, yes, you are right, that this is a lost body of scholarship, a forgotten to a large degree body of scholarship, just like scholars and their trajectories are not very much consciously part of our intellectual biographies as a cohort, as a transnational cohort. So while I'm pointing at these lines and trajectories of continuity, I hope it will also bring them more to the surface and make us maybe in some ways aware of how what might be new is not so new, or maybe that some of the questions that we're asking today have been already raised, and what does it mean for the field. Now, to Igor's comments, I can only say, you know, these are fantastically important issues. Prochownik, Wal, and Esterka, obviously, but I made a painful decision simply to finish this book because it was a very, very, very long gestation as it was, and hoping that this will, you know, someone will take on all the missing points, all the important missing points. And I agree with you that the interface, as it were, between belles lettres, fictional writing, and history writing is very, very, very important, but it would require, I think, a book of itself. This is a monograph that someone should definitely write, and then Pauline as a place to rest, and a Polish forest, and Esterka, and all of these important myths will very much come to speak to us from the point of view of historical consciousness as well. So while I admit that this is absolutely worth their own pages, it's simply not going to be in this book.
Thank you very much. Marcin, Igor, Professor Lehnstaedt, would you like to add anything to that? Igor, yes, Igor and Marcin, yes, please. Igor, could I ask you?
I think I will give the floor to Marcin, since
okay.
He's our guest. Yeah,
okay.
So after you.
Okay. I skipped one question, one very important question from Marcin, but I will come back to it.
Okay, one comment I wanted to make to what you commented to Igor about these issues of actually, and to my comments also. You were talking about the place of actually Polish Jewish history in a wider reflection on Jewish history in general, when you're talking about non-visibility of those. And here you are perfectly right, and I'm making this argument in my bibliometric analysis of what is publishing, what's being published these days in international Jewish studies field. Is very visible. Eastern Europe is hardly visible as an area, as an important area of Jewish history. And here you are perfectly right, but actually my question was about something more about us, people within Polish Jewish history, how much we learn from those historians, how much they are not our grandfathers or grandmothers, rarely. In a sense, how much the scholarship we build today is actually rooted in what they did. And actually several stories we heard about, Stephan was saying, about discovery of the book that should be just essentials, right? And we have to discover it still. It's not obvious. It's not Aleph base of what any historian doing Polish history or Polish Jewish history would do. So this is my point, that it somehow does not develop naturally because the backbone of transmission was broken at the Holocaust, possibly. And there's one generation missing for many reasons. Most of them perished during the Holocaust, but some of them left, as you were saying, going out of Poland, going out into different areas. You have Duker, who's doing very different things. You have Friedman, who's moving into the Holocaust studies. So all those trajectories live outside, I think. So and so that's actually what is missing for us. This one generation.
Yeah, if I can interrupt for a second with something that I hope to still find a record of, maybe for a short article if I ever did. So Philip Friedman was teaching Jewish history for 2 semesters at the newly opened University of Łódź, right after the university was created, and when he moved from Lviv to what was now New Borders of Poland. And a dear colleague went and photographed the pages of the file of Friedman from his human resources department, but all it had was that he was hired and that he was hired to teach, and then he left. I would love to see, I don't know if it exists, student lists, students who took these classes with
Catch
him.
Kuba Goldberg on the list, huh?
This is a question. This is a question. I mean, 46, I don't know. So, but this is, this is this moment of transmission that was happening and then stopped, precisely. And then there are other moments of transition. Yes, you of course you mentioned Jakub Goldberg, and Friedman teaches at Columbia University, and I looked at some of the reading lists, but he had primarily students who couldn't read Polish. So there is also the question of research that is being lost due to language, and the shift of the centers of Polish Jewish history, well, until the department in Wrocław was established to a large degree, but yes, there's a lot of loss on the way, and it would be curious. We are all of a certain generation. It would be curious. I mean, again, Marcin, do your students on a level of BA or MA, do they read Bałaban as their obligatory reading list?
Very little. But actually, if they read literature, it is very important for me personally and for our other faculty to talk about origins, to trace how it developed. So even if they don't read Bałaban or others, they know how the current stage of knowledge is developing through chain of generations. And actually, that's what we actually do on, you remember the 10 plaques about Professor Woronczak. That's exactly for the reason to teach our students we didn't come from nothing. We have our intellectual genealogy, and that's what we do within courses too. But as I say, this is somehow broken. We can refer to this, but there's no obvious line, like you were saying, Małowicz, Samsonowicz, Małowicz, Handelsman, right? It is lost. This Jewish line of transmission is broken.
Yeah, I agree. Now the question is, Bałaban's magisterial history of Jews in Kraków and Kazimierz was published in Hebrew, right? That will it allow students of history, of Jewish history in Israel reading it? The new editions, will it bring it more back to life? And again, do we all read Gretz? Do we all read Dubnow? Important forefathers of, we also stand on their shoulders. And I recently made a experiment and assigned 100 pages of Dubnow to my seminar, and the students struggled. Because the text was reading to them very ancient, and we ended up having exactly the kind of discussion that we're having now, the kind of ideas that we recognize in his writing that they were not aware might be connected all the way to Dubnow. But yes,
Natalia, but our students don't read Dubnow or Gretz, but they do read Rossmann, very recent scholar, who is discussing influence of Gretz and Dubnow concepts on us today, and Bałaban is not there. That's the point.
But now, due to Natalia's book, it will be. Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. Yeah. Just a short comment on my part, because we have a very interesting question by Aleksandra Avramczuk. But well, when I was talking about Jewish Polish culture of memory, I was also paying attention to the channels through which this content was delivered to the world of the Westjuden. So Samuel Agnon and his German edition from 1916. Bałaban, who writes, two quoted by me essays in German. And I think that this is also quite important to look at this transmission of the Polish history of Polish Jews and culture of memory, taking into account German language, allgemeine slawische Sprache und jüdische Sprache auch. Ja? Mm-hmm.
I agree, and I disagree on the note that again, going back to and yes, I mean there is an important aspect of all these Galicianers for whom German is one of the natural language of communication, of scholarship. This is not a stretch that they're making. They read, write, and publish. But when Bałaban is checking out a possibility of employment at a Hebrew University in Jerusalem, he finds that it's not really he's not really welcome there. And if we're talking about history of Wissenschaft des Judentums, it is very much still conceptualized via Berlin, right? This is a project of German-speaking Jews, and interestingly enough, Polish Jewish historians are very well aware of it already in their own intellectual context. And part of the project is to say, well, we belong to this project, but we are our own variation. We are no Graz and no Jost, but we're no Dubnov either. We're our own historiographical beast. And so, yes, I think what Marcin is suggesting might be the most feasible scenario, which is not hoping for massive checking out of Bałaban's books from university libraries by crowds of students, but bringing critical scholarship that weaves this scholarship into contemporary methodological discussions of scholars such as Rossmann, to realize, yes, the extent to which a lot has stayed the same. A lot of the challenges and the questions and the vision of writing is mirrors that of the cohort of Bałaban and his students.
Yeah, but if we talk about this this mission of spreading the word, then I think we can clearly identify why this didn't work. I mean, those Polish Jewish historians, they taught in Poland, they taught in Polish. They were murdered in the Holocaust. Most of their students were murdered in the Holocaust, and those who actually, I mean, we have the Zionist scholars who migrated to Israel prior to the Holocaust. We have those assimilated Germans who like Scholem or so, who also migrated. I mean, and then set up their own, I mean, they have their own circles of pupils, and all those pupils spread the word and said, well, this is my doctoral promoter, read his works, and they told it to their students. There was simply no one who said, well, listen, it's worth reading Bałaban. Yeah, you had Samsonowicz, that's great, and that's why you are now spreading the word. But that's just the thing. I mean, who could do it, and who could do it, say, beyond Poland? I mean, it's like the international Jewish studies is not shaped from Poland. Unfortunately, it's dominated by Israel and by the US, and those Polish Jewish scholars, they were not read. And this is the tragedy. I mean, this is a tragedy in many ways, because it also ends in a way this you called it the Galician connection, and it ends this tradition of multicultural Habsburg university approaches. I mean, but you have it actually, which is kind of interesting, that you very much have it in the legal, for legal scholars, because you have Lemkin and his concept of genocide emerging, which is also very much influenced by Habsburg multicultural empire. This is something that continues, but it's because Lemkin survives, and then he well, kind of, we get the UN Genocide Convention, but there is the transmission of Bauerbahn is difficult. And when I look at this this edition of the Judenstadt, it's, I mean, he wrote it in German when he was a military rabbi for the Austrians in Lublin. And then he published it in 1919 in German. And what I have here is a reprint from Lublin, and it's the reprint of the German original in Lublin in 2012, which in itself is a fantastic project.
Yeah.
But I wonder how many people in Lublin buy this book and actually can read it. I mean, I'm a German, yeah, of course I read it. And by chance I found it, but how many Poles in Lublin will buy this book and say, well, look, it's about our town, let's read it. And that's the tragedy.
Well,
Yeah. Igor, go ahead. No, go ahead.
no, I mean, somehow indirectly, though this is a kind of consolating myself, Bauerbahn is readable through mostly through the model of Krakow in the Jewish Museum Polin and Warsaw. I know that Adam Teller, working on the model extensively, was using Bauerbann's history of the Jews in Krakow. So, but as I say,
François Genet was actually citing in his work the MA thesis done under Bauerban. I mean, it's not completely gone. It's, you know, I think that, I don't know, maybe I just want to be optimistic, strangely for an Eastern European, but I think to some extent, I would argue that, Marcin, what you're doing in Wrocław, in your department, to my mind, is a continuity of that project, whether students you know, are forced to read all of Bauerban as a condition to graduate or not, but those main points on which this school was built, which is that you cannot have a study of Polish, again, broadly defined Polish past, Polish culture, without taking in the Jewish component, and not as a kind of footnote, but very much organically woven into your research. And so in that sense, I think this is probably the closest to what Bauerban and others were building. Now, to some extent, if again, Adam Teller is one of those scholars that we could say, you know, he's a student of Jakub Goldberg, who came from that school, and Judith Kalik, and then hopefully others. So I don't think that this is. I think we're coming back very much to some of the same realization that I was trying to, for this book, to argue, that this is not a completely gone project. It's a tragically interrupted project, yes, and there is no way around it. That it was, for the most part, destroyed and kind of stopped in the middle, and we can only imagine what would have happened had it continued for another decade. And would Hillel Zeidman create this central archives, possibly even more accessible than the central archives of the history of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, which has wonders of wonders in its collections. What would have happened with local history projects that were in the middle of being made in Częstochowa, for example. And all these manuscripts that we know that people had, right, that were lost, just like their authors. The manuscript that Bela Mandelsberg, or at least two manuscripts that we know of in Lublin. The manuscript that Philip Friedman sent to Salo Baron, and Salo Baron sent it back to him with comments, one copy, just before the war broke out, and that was it. And others and others. So yes, I think there's a way to mourn the project that was orphaned and interrupted, but also to see the ways in which we can connect ourselves to it.
Thank you very much. Yes, Igor, you wanted to ask?
Very last
Very
comment, because I found also interesting Marcin's a question about Marxism. Yes, I have also noted that only one, but let me tell you about something what I was struck by. So when you were writing about the Polish Jewish historians, and they focus on the history of daily life. And to some extent, it was methodologically a very modern approach, to some extent in connection with the Annal school. And paradoxically, somewhat, then I'm reading in your book all these critical comments by awful anti-Semitic, outstanding, unfortunately, Polish historians, such as Rybarski, Rutkowski, Bujak, and they unfortunately presented a very modern methodological approach influenced by the Annal school. Nonetheless, they were anti-Semites. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Sorry.
And we'll still read them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are excellent as historians.
No,
right?
I must say that reading Bujak's The Jewish Question in Poland was painful because, you know, I greatly admire his work and the building of the school of economic history and the publications that both he published and publications that came from him, that of people that he mentored. So yes, if I can steal another moment, because it connects to the question that I wrote down, but then missed when I was looking at the notes, which is the connection between politics and history writing. To some extent, it touches on Rybarski and Bujak just as much as it touches on Mahler and Bela Schildkraut. And yes, they are scholars, but they're hardly operating in some kind of universal bubble. They are all very much connected to political projects and certain visions of Poland, and visions of Poland that have to do very much with where the Jews are in that vision. So you have, on the one hand, a vision in which Jews are at best unwelcomed, ungrateful guests and problematic guests whose, this 60% or whatever, Marcin, you mentioned, of Jewish population in a given town is not a reason to integrate them into the social and economic history, but rather see it as a proof of a problem that had existed in the past already and is even more of a problem in a resurrected state now being in the 1920s and 1930s. And for for Mahler and Bauerban and Ringelblum and Schildkraut and many others, it's this interest in writing about working class Jews and writing about the situation of members of professional feudal guilds or Jews operating outside of those guilds rather. This is very much an expression of not just intellectual curiosity, but this is their politics. This is their contemporary politics, their involvement with Poale-Zion left for the most part. And this is something that I must say, while I very much argued in this book that Jewish historians writing that Polish Jewish history, there were other Jewish historians, of course, as well, some of them few, but some were students of Bujak and wrote, completely not Jewish studies, not even touching on Jewish, Polish Jewish or otherwise history, but that this project is an apolitical, non-partisan project where, almost in a surreal way, the lamb is sitting next to a lion. Marxists, communists, Bundists, Zionists, and members of Agudat Israel, Orthodox Jews, Hillel Zeidman and others are happily constructing the building of Polish Jewish history. I'm sure that it was a little bit more complicated than that. I don't have the files of the protocols of the Junghistoriker. They might have been extremely heated debates along political lines as well, political/methodological, what you research, how you research, what are the questions that you want to ask, and how do you conclude based on the material. But the truth is also that if you count, it's a little bit like with the Galicianers. It's a Polish Jewish historiographical project with a very visible monopole, or Galician Jews are very, very numerous among them. They're not all, but they're very numerous. And in terms of politics, a lot of those young historians are members of Poale-Zion left, which is a very particular ideological project with Yiddish, with Marxism, Zionism, synthesized by Borochov. So what does it really mean? Did they bring, one member brought another member of a similar intellectual and political sympathy for research and politics? There is an imbalance, even though still I would argue it's a project where people collaborate with, but that politics does shape a very particular aspect, especially to research done by the younger generation.
Marcin, one last question, please.
Very short question.
Yes,
I wanted to,
yes.
Natalia, I praise your book for bringing this political aspect to the fore. It's very clear in your book. You make very strong argument there. There's no need to add. That's very clear to me. When I say that you don't devote enough space for Marxists, in my opinion, it's not about the political angle. It is about methodology, historical methodology, what it brings. Because on the one hand, you are very clear this is politically motivated, but on the other hand, it adds very innovative, very modern, up-to-date aspect of doing history in interwar Poland. They are extremely innovative historians by employing those methods of analysis. And then the question is, where it leads to, how it develops further, what are the dividing line between them and the positivist historians with whom they debate, but they also their students. This is not so strongly visible. The division is not only political, but it goes also into the way of your craft, how you do history. So
Yeah.
that was my comment about, very short, as promised.
Thank you.
I agree, 100%.
Thank you. We should be slowly wrapping up, but we still have a question from from our audience, actually from one person, from Mr. Alexander Avramchuk, to whom we say hello. He says, in 1936, a US historian of Jewish background, Oskar Janowski, came to Warsaw to conduct research on national minority rights in Poland. He interviewed some prominent Polish officials and met with Marceli Handelsman. Strikingly enough, in his memoirs, Janowski considered Handelsman, and it's quote, a nasty anti-Semite, a zealous follower of Piłsudski, a fervent Polish patriot, and a detractor of minorities, unquote. Have you analyzed, it's the question to Natalia, have you analyzed Janowski's memoirs in your book? For sure, Janowski was prejudiced to Polonized Jews, but how were those Polish Jewish intellectuals regarded by the Jewish community in the West?
What a great question. So no, and this is something that I will look for in the Jena library as soon as I get offline. Very interesting, but it reminds me of a very ambivalent way that Ringelblum writes about Bauerban and writes about Handelsman. In general, it's not just Jews from the West that might be looking with critical eye at. Yes, I think that calling Handelsman a Polonized Jew, or likely even a Pole of Jewish background, since he, it seems, really saw himself primarily as a Polish patriot, while he didn't deny his Jewish roots. This was also a question for Polish Jews, and it has to do, Marcin was mentioning methodological discussions. It of course goes to the question of language, right? For Ringelblum and his immediate political circle, it was very important to develop this historiography, at least also in Yiddish, if not primarily in Yiddish. And then you had scholars of the older generation, not Schipper, but certainly Bauerban and Shor, who were not interested in much in writing in Yiddish. And in fact, this is a question also of how much they themselves were a product of a rather Polonized Galician Jewish background. I interviewed one of, I was lucky to still have a chance to interview one of students at the Institute of Judaic Studies in Warsaw, who also emigrated to Mandatory Palestine in mid-30s, I believe. And he, in fact, came to Warsaw to study at the university, get a diploma, and get out of Poland. This was his project to begin with. He came from a Hebrew-speaking, actually really Hebrew-speaking family. He was sent to a Hebrew Hebrew kindergarten. Hebrew was spoken, ideologically spoken at home. And he told me that he and some other students were shocked at how unimpressive was Bauerban's ability to analyze Jewish gravestones, and that his Hebrew was not so great. I remember hearing this testimony and kind of cringing internally, but there is certainly a question of language preferences and cultural affinities. It's interesting that he describes, I definitely want to see that those memoirs, that he describes him as an anti-Semite, very devoted follower of Piłsudski. He certainly was. This was someone who believed in a project of Poland as envisioned by Piłsudski.
Thank you.
Well, just a short comment. So the question was asked by Alexander Avramchuk, who himself is writing or he has already written his doctoral thesis on the Polish and East European historians after World War II. One of the chapters is about Professor Sulima Kamiński, and here, when we are talking about connections and continuations, Professor Rossman attended Andrzej Sulima Kamiński's the seminar. And I would be glad if Alexander would be able to remain in touch with you, Natalia.
Yes, please.
Yes, okay.
I'm extremely curious about this particular text, but also please publish your dissertation.
Thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you, Alexander, for your question. It's a nice coincidence that you had an opportunity to ask it, and maybe something interesting and good will come out of it. Thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of our meeting tonight. So thank you very much, Professor Natalia Aleksiun, for the presentation of your book, for this very interesting conversation. We wish you a huge success with your book. It is due to appear next month, right?
Yeah, it will be as soon as the airports open. I'm sure it will be sold at the airports bookstores.
Fantastic. Professor Stephan Lehnstaedt, Professor Marcin Wodziński, Professor Igor Kąkolewski, thank you all for joining us tonight too. To our viewers, thank you for watching. Many thanks to Agnieszka Zawadzka, our technical support. It's been a lovely evening, very informative. Have a good rest of it. And from me and the team of the Center for Historical Research in Berlin, supported by Touro College Berlin and the Polin Museum Warsaw, it's good night and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you so much.